I'm Rantasmo, and what makes a queer narrative authentic? A new game in the Life is Strange series is coming out this September, and not only is it named after my favorite Cyndi Lauper single, it seems as though it will continue the series' legacy of blending beautiful, rich environments with character-driven slice-of-life melodrama. And to celebrate, I have grown a huge beard! But as excited as I am to play as a mystery-solving Gen Z empath, today I want to talk about a slightly different game. One that, as it happens, you can actually download for free right now during Pride Month. Like the first two games in the main Life is Strange series, Tell Me Why was also developed by Dontnod Entertainment. It tells the story of two twins, Tyler and Allison, who return to their childhood home in Alaska 10 years after a traumatic event involving their mother, Marianne, whom Tyler evidently killed in self-defense. The twins have up to this point believed that their mother tried to kill Tyler in an attack motivated by transphobia. But as they uncover hidden secrets and discover that they have the ability to conjure forth visions of their memories, they begin to suspect that the truth isn't exactly as it seems. Tell Me Why didn't get quite as much buzz as the Life is Strange games, likely because it was released in fall of 2020 when we were otherwise occupied, but it does exist in a very similar space. Like Life is Strange, it's an adventure game driven by puzzle solving and a choice-based narrative, and it centers around lead characters who have a supernatural power. The game is different enough, however, that I can see why it wasn't made under the Life is Strange banner. The Life is Strange games that have been released thus far, at least the two that are part of the main series, are fundamentally character-driven, but they also have very prominent supernatural elements that tend to facilitate grand, epic, earth-shattering stories that sometimes border on pulp. Tell Me Why, on the other hand, tells a much more grounded, intimate, personal story on a much smaller scale. And the supernatural element only reinforces the character development rather than serving as a major plot point in and of itself. The characters don't summon a tornado with time travel or assault the American Border Patrol with telekinesis. Their power is effectively their own memories and their personal connection with each other. Much of the game is spent exploring the relics of the protagonist's childhood. Marianne created an elaborate fairy tale fantasy world with her children that was strongly influenced by events in her own life. And through these stories and artifacts, the twins gain a greater sense of just who their mother was. There is an impressive amount of detail here, and speaking as someone who normally stays far away from anything resembling a codex in most video games, it was pretty interesting to flip through the storybook and imagine how it reflected the family's real life. The rest of the gameplay involves speaking with people in the town and seeking out visions that show how the twins remember their past. The twins' memories don't always match up with one another, and a recurring theme is just how fallible memories can be. How the truth can never be unequivocally known, and how at a certain point, what actually happened sometimes isn't quite as important as what you believe happened. Tell Me Why is also particularly notable in that it is, I'm fairly certain, the first AAA game to feature a playable transgender main character. Because transgender representation is so rare in games by major publishers, and because what little does exist has often been handled poorly, there was an understandable amount of pressure to get this right, to portray trans people as authentically as possible. Did they do so? Well, I don't know that I'm really in a position to make that judgment, but even amongst transgender critics, there's a fair bit of contention there. With pretty much any sort of queer media theory, I don't think it's especially helpful to talk about whether something is a good representation, because the people who say that are often talking about totally different things. Are we talking about whether the representation is accurate, positive, respectful, interesting, whether it adheres to cliches or problematic tropes, whether people in the community in question were involved in the creation and/or portrayal of the character, whether Ryan Murphy was involved somehow. Based on how the transgender community has largely reacted, I think it's fair to say that Tell Me Why's trans representation is unequivocally positive and respectful. For starters, Tyler's dead name is never used once throughout the entire game. The few times that Tyler is misgendered or experiences transphobia were addressed in a public FAQ before the game was actually released, so players could go in knowing pretty much exactly what to expect. The developers really went out of their way to either avoid or provide substantial content warnings for material that transgender players might find triggering. I realize by saying the word triggering, I'm inviting like a very specific type of person into my comments, but I truly have no to give. Tyler himself is played by August Black, a trans man voice actor. In spite of the trauma he's been through, Tyler is shown to be a strong-willed, well-adjusted, kind person. While the game does initially present him as having killed someone, it's framed as an act of self-defense and avoids any evil transgender murderer tropes. It's weird that I feel I have to specify this, but Tyler also does not die during the course of the story. And in all of the game's endings, there's an overall sense of optimism and happiness regarding Tyler's future. Moreover, Tyler's trauma is never implied to be the cause of his transness. In fact, his transness and his trauma seem almost entirely divorced from one another. And therein lies where things get a bit complicated. On paper, Tell Me Why does everything right in creating a character that trans people are unlikely to find objectionable. But several transgender critics have made the argument that in essentially following all the rules and avoiding risks, the developers have made a very safe, inoffensive character that's just not all that interesting. I don't think it's an unfair criticism, though it could very well apply to most of Dontnod's body of work. I dare to say that Max Caulfield from Life is Strange is not an especially risky or interesting character either. There's also a discussion to be had about how exactly authenticity is measured, or if such a thing can even be done. Tell Me Why touches upon issues of trauma, and even that in relation to the trans experience. But it engages it with such a light touch that it sometimes feels a tad hollow. The fact that Tyler is never dead-named in the game is great from a sensitivity angle, but it's the case even when talking to characters who have pointedly transphobic beliefs, who in real life almost certainly would misgender and or dead-name Tyler. At one point, Tyler reads a police report from his childhood that refers to him only as Allison's sibling. A situation where realistically, yeah, Tyler's dead name would probably be in that report. Would it have been better to go ahead and use Tyler's dead name in those scenes, or to write the story in such a way that those scenes never even existed? I couldn't really say, and if anyone is the judge of what transgender representation should look like, it's certainly not me. But the impression I'm getting is that Tell Me Why sort of tries to have it both ways, exploring the trauma associated with being trans in a transphobic society, but softening the actual impact of that trauma, making it relatively convenient, simple, and at times hand-wavy to deal with. Marianne, whose attack on Tyler is initially presented as being motivated by transphobia, is later revealed to have not actually been transphobic at all, and was in fact educating herself about how to best affirm and support Tyler during his transition. It's a tad convenient, but it is an interesting scenario, and I think it would have been interesting to see Tyler engaged with the idea that his mother was, in an unexpectedly positive way, not the person he thought she was. But I feel like the game spends barely any time on this aspect of it, and I think it does so in part so that it can avoid being a story about transgender trauma. Again, this is not at all to say that a queer narrative necessarily has to have trauma in order to be authentic. But if a story is going to try to engage with the idea of queer trauma at all, it seems a little weird to pull so many punches. I don't think this game would be placed under so much scrutiny in a world where trans main characters in major video games were less of a rarity. And for whatever faults it might have, I felt Tell Me Why was an enjoyable experience. Again, all 3 chapters are available for free during June of 2021, so if you're watching this then, give it a download. And while you're at it, if you like this video, feel free to subscribe and check out my Patreon. You can help me grow this channel and also my beard.